All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Shriya Musuku. I'm a mechanical engineer who recently completed my bachelor's and master's, and I have an interest in urban design, planning, and visualizing space habitats. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So some topics of discussion are the fundamentals of urban design and how cities are planned and how we can apply that in a space setting. A couple of things we'll look into are the aesthetics, how radiation and the safety aspect of it affects our internal design of a building, and look into an example of a health facility that I had designed on Mission 175 of Habitat Marti. So that was an awesome opportunity where we visualized lunar surface and looked at how a health facility or different locations on the lunar colony can be designed, and that was something that I inspired this presentation off of. So after that, I'm going to talk about some resources to generate on the moon or transport, because that's something where it's always a problem when we travel to space. We don't have everything that we have on Earth, so that's another important topic. Of course, there's food. How do we get our food? How do we get our water? And then I'm going to spin off into some larger topics like 3D printing and impact to sustainable development goals to see how we can extend our life on space, planets like Moon and Mars much further. So diving right into the fundamentals of urban design, we have diversity as a key principle. So all of these principles were developed by an international company, and that is how I got these. So this was a panel of many urban designers and city planners sitting together. And that's something that I think is the first thing, right? Because as we go to space, as we go to such an international and even interplanetary realm, looking into how different people, how different beings can live on these different spaceships and colonies becomes very important. So then moving that into the human-centric aspect of it, it has to be easy to live in and use and comfortable. So if we go to the moon or Mars, when we do that, it's like another thing to visualize is how the buildings are designed. Are we going to scale upwards? Are we going to stay more flat? Are we going to have more of a spread? The best thing that was found by this company and this panel of designers was that scaling these buildings with a mixture is easy, so that people have walkability, people have these private and public spaces that they can still use, but then we're also capturing that vertical space where we can have multi-floor buildings one day on our interplanetary colonies. Then moving into a couple other things, right? So I've touched upon this, but mixing the expected and unexpected visuals are very important. So right now, when we design something, we're designing a pod or a spaceship to be repeatable. But as we colonize the moon and Mars, we will be very bored if we're trying to live there, if we have only one type of building everywhere. And it also might not suit our needs. So thinking about how we can customize and modularize our buildings from the get-go becomes very important. Then that part about street life and walkability, right? So there's been several studies that show humans are built to travel, walk around, and explore, and having that aspect on Moon and Mars right now is hard, but as we build more and more buildings and communities, as we settle in that colony, say 20, 30, 40, even more years later, that's something that we can plan for. So that's why it's a little lower down on the list, but it's still one of the top 10 principles. And then it comes in the open space and layering. This is a challenge on the international plane right now because the moon and Mars don't have any atmosphere. So how are we going to provide open spaces for people to breathe fresh air, right? There's none of that. And one idea that was formed was to use these principles and create large open buildings to then create a dome of fresh air, kind of like you see on science fiction movies. And after that, the last principle to move into is to build a microclimate and community, because as human beings, we have different preferences, temperature, communities that we want to involve in activities. So really looking at the perspective of human centricism and branching off into all of the things that make us human is where this urban design is centralized. So let's look at some of the aesthetics aspect of it. That first part we talked about, how do we make buildings something that we can live in and that look good. Using lunar habits as a case study, we have to think about sustainability to make our buildings beautiful, cohesive, and functional from the start. So that shows that aesthetics have impact, right? If we look at these three pictures right now, we have something that looks out into the moon, and now you can see kind of into the darkness and visualize what that would look like. As humans looking out of a window, there's something beautiful and magical about what we see, and I think trying to capture that is very, very important. Right now, rockets, they still have some windows, but then we come into this issue of radiation. How can we make our buildings so open like those concepts that we just saw? Well, we have several types of radiation we're dealing with. So 99% of radiation is solar, and 1% are galactic cosmic rays. Of those 1%, 3% cause the most damage because they are literally particles from exploding stars. How cool is that? Like, that to me is quite awesome in the sense that, yes, there's something bad about radiation, but this is star particles that we're being affected by. And I think that's something beyond us in a way that is very hard to explain. But now, how do we tackle that? So looking at radiation safety, NASA and ESA and all of the space agencies that we have so far have spent significant resources on that. Countering radiation is typically done by making a shield of similar materials of same or smaller size particles. With galactic cosmic rays being so small, typically it's like hydrogen-rich water or nanotubes that have polar interactions in the chemicals that really allow that countering of such small particles. One other test that has been done with the matter collected from the moon, the lunar soil, was to 3D print the regolith because it protects against microabrasion and fine particles. So that's another thing that we can consider as we build our buildings and create that exterior to reinforce that and make our inside of the building more livable, more beautiful, and safe. So a couple of examples I have here, these images. The nanotubes and particles can create a clear film in theory, and that's one visualization I had for radiation safety. Moving into the health facility that I had worked on during that mission 175, we had a great time visualizing a pod and then creating that for a specific use. So this pod is meant to fit on SpaceX's Starship, the heavy booster, I think it would be kind of launching it up to space. And it's designed to fit within a 9-meter diameter and be collapsible, be modifiable. So all of the walls that you see in blue for each of the 3 floors of this health facility would be something that you can remove and install. The hexagonal shape is something that creates a modular fit, right? So you can stack these up on top of each other, or if you don't want to build a skyrise, you can put them out beside each other and connect them via the doors. Apart from that, so now looking at a health facility, we have different things that we need for it. So exam rooms, closets, a gym for the people who live there, bedrooms, and a common area. So these are included as basics of what humans would need. So looking into entertainment and psychology is one thing that has been a huge focus lately, and that's part of the design, and that's part of that human centricism that we're talking about. So what resources do we take to space with us? Looking at every planet, it's different. For the moon in particular, there's different pros and cons to living on each side of it. So this graphic is a really great example. So we have polar regions, we have the near side and the far side of the moon. Polar regions are constantly lit up by the sun, more radiation, but they have ice. The near side, great view of Earth. It's closer to home. It's got craters, so pros and cons there. The far side, same thing, but it's very, very dark, radio silence. It's going to be hard to come back to Earth if we want to come and launch ourselves over. So those are considerations that we should have when designing a colony. Now, what do we have on the moon that wherever we pick, that we can use? One would be that solar power we talked about. So that is something we'd have to balance to at least create radiation shields if we find a place where it has constant illumination. Then we have natural resources. Surprisingly, we have water, ice on the moon that we can extract and use. It's not something that's been considered too well as of late, but that's because extracting that takes some drilling, some machinery, and that's effort. So that's something that NASA and ESA have been putting a lot of work into. We also have metals, so we can probably extract them from the surface similar to what we do on Earth, but that's going to take further exploration because of that lunar dust and regolith that we talked about. Now, moving right into that, what can the regolith do for us, right? I've talked about how it can be radiation safety, but it can also be a source of oxygen. It's got trapped oxygen within itself to be used and extracted from. The only thing is that we have to be very careful. And the irony, me using the lung symbol, is that this regolith also is what has created lung problems in astronauts, right? It's dust, it's particles that are so abrasive that they came back with irreversible damage. So being very careful with that is one thing to note there. And then we also have methane, ammonia, CO2, so sources of fuel, sources of like fire extinguishers, and so on. What do we need to bring from the Earth? Organic materials, that doesn't exist on the moon, carbon, nitrogen, food, automated machines to extract the regolith or the resources from the moon. Now that is one thing where each kilogram of payload from Earth takes a lot of money. It takes something like $100,000, I think it is. Don't quote me on that. But extreme amounts of money, especially if you want to keep it safe and keep it well protected while it's going through the forces of the launch. So with that, bringing those up into space with us is something to consider, but also keep as a minimalist design. So a lot of factors playing into this living on the moon, as we know. With that, we also need secure habitats and shelter. So that's really our focus of the presentation. So I'm going to move back into that part of it. In our shelters, we also need to include food microproduction, and I was thinking about how we do that. The best way is to create a greenhouse garden where the carbon dioxide rises to the top if we can keep our pod insulated and located on the surface. With that, I feel like that's one really great way to maintain oxygen at the bottom. And as the carbon dioxide rises, you can capture it back and recircle the air. So that's one thought with the densities of oxygen and CO2. The other thing here is plants across the room can be modified with like pressurized facilities, and with that, you can create this little egg-shaped, I would say, greenhouse like facility, and that is something where if you don't want all of this mixing of the air, you can go in and just contain our plants and food production in that little area. So that can also be helpful for more delicate plants that need a climate-controlled pod. Now, looking into 3D printing and moving into some of those longer-term aspects, we have 3D printing of regolith. Talked about that a lot. Now, we also have some more interesting organic material that we can consider printing. So printing of tissues for organ research and replacement has been huge of late. As we see here, there's a patient-specific scaffolds that people are creating. And with space, microgravity, or low gravity on the moon, it's very different on how those scaffolds are structured. They will not collapse on each other as easily. So the theory is that when you're creating these organs, space could be a really good place to do that, to keep them intact. Also, it's shown that stem cells do grow and divide in space, so that's really cool. Adding some bio ink from egg whites creates tissues because that's an adhesive matter. And now that might be a good way to speed up organ transplants, stem cell, and lung research. With that, we also go into some of those mechanical elements that we'd have to bring to space with us. Microfluidics research, how nozzles work for 3D printers, how fluid's going to work, right? Because if we have greenhouses and 3D printing and all of this, we're going to have to be able to understand the mechanical properties of all of our materials in space. So materials research is also a huge aspect that we need to integrate into our designs. All that being said, zooming out to an even bigger picture, when we have urban design and all of these little elements that we're including into our larger building, we are impacting our sustainable development goals established by the United Nations. So those are listed below. There are 17 goals that were determined a while ago by the United Nations Committee. And I highlighted the ones in red that would be pretty immediate in my mind. Now, this is subjective, so feel free to contest or question that. But with that, we have good health and well-being, equality for the people we transport up, clean water, energy, and proper infrastructure to have responsible consumption, and climate action, right? We have a climate on Earth. The moon has a climate. Us going there is going to impact that. So keeping that in mind, we have to have responsible institutions as well to impact all of these. And the biggest thing at the end is to achieve all of these goals, to create that urban design, to create that city, we need to have really good partnerships. So people first. Thank you, everyone.